So I'm quickly realizing that a video, I'm reminded of how different it is to present or do something of over a recorded video as opposed to live, because this idea of like messing up, which becomes, you know, a normal thing that you kind of carry on in the live moment, especially if you're presenting. Um, so I think I'm really going to embrace the idea, which I spoke about a little yesterday, which was trying to keep this bite-sized and focused, than being a really long presentation, because, you know, I realize there's some perfectionist element about a video that, just makes it like so easy to stop and start again. And I've been doing that, so I'm gonna stop. I don't know if this will make it in the video, so I'm gonna start anyway. Hey everyone, this is my presentation about the reviews we looked at. For the presentation, I'm going to look at 3 of the 4 reviews that we read, particularly of Apadure, Hazel, and Anpamara. Looking at these themes, there's like a thematic engagement I'm trying to have, which is to look at how they look at this idea of focus, this idea of language, and this idea of what the relevance to the present moment. In the PDF that I send, I'll arrange these highlights in those themes, but for the presentation, I'll be going kind of chronologically as the highlights of as they're going through highlights of each of these reviews, so that I can have some sense of coherence as I present this. So I'll get started. So firstly with Apadure, like I kind of tried to start presenting yesterday with, for me there was a lot of strangeness in engaging with Wilkerson's work. A lot of the questions that I had was like, why is she using the word caste? And that made me think about the history of caste and in the etymology, as the 4th review kind of speaks about in parts of it, and also as Elsa mentioned, which is also interesting to think about, right? Because even when it comes from Portuguese, which then comes from Latin, the idea of casta even then came in as a colonial experience, as part of the colonial conquest, right? They were essentially trying to still talk about the same thing that we think of as caste, which was just, an interesting thing to look at as I read, and then I was reminded through Apadure's idea of acknowledging that it can be a strange thing, especially for someone like me, who's been familiar with the idea of caste mostly in an Indian, if not South Asian, aspect, or focus. And with all that said, I think this, I just had to show this, which I think it was just cool for him to acknowledge that there is this want to criticize from like his wealth of knowledge, but he's not going to do that, which is less about, I guess, the badassery of it, but more so I think in important way for us to look at this text, which for me is familiar in the way that we might look at a play or a movie, and try to analyze it from the world of that play and not try to think from outside of it, which tries to which for me is about like not trying to completely paint it with only our notions and ideas of analyzing things, and trying to think about what the world of that creation is. And in this case, I think he's trying to allude to that. But I still think it's cool because he's like, I could completely criticize this in a very different angle, but we're going to look at what this is trying to do and figure out the mode of action that Wilkerson is trying to engage with. So this I also highlighted. I think this is one of the first important things that stood out to me, which was in what we read, which was part 3, and different chapters with different pillars, which had much to do with the pillar of purity, right? And I think the overarching point that he's making, that is, I think kind of like a bold statement, is kind of debasing perhaps that chapter or this comparison that she makes, because as we know, a lot of, especially in what we read, a lot of her mode of action is to kind of show something that happens in India, something that happened in the US, and in some case what happened in Germany, as some sorts of comparisons and then creating a connection. But I think this entire thing, which I'm not going to read, but it'll be there in the PDF. He's kind of saying that, cool, you've made a comparison, but maybe especially in this part when you talk about purity, you haven't really made a connection. You've definitely stated facts, but those facts are in and of itself showing why there's more of a disconnect than some way to support her idea of using the word caste. He talks here about like how the complexity of caste, as opposed to the absolutist way race works in the US is even more a sign of how different they are, and perhaps why it doesn't make sense to use the word caste than the opposite. So yeah, fundamentally being like, hey, what is that chapter about? Is what I felt when I read this chapter. And an important thing which I kind of highlighted yesterday was like, the difference is that like that last line. So in short, no group in India, however low, lacks a group beneath them that lets them feel purer. This is very different from the exclusionary logic of race, which is binary, black versus white, and lacks any cosmological basis for one black person to feel racially superior to another black. This paragraph for me was on the focus of language, and this I think I am going to read because for me he's pointing to this confusion of like there's this mode of action, right, which is like what she's trying to talk about, but how maybe it's more even a bit of like a selfish act, which points to she wants to do something which he describes in this chapter, and she's using this idea of caste as some sort of refurbished idea so that people can kind of re-look at the same thing, which is race and all that race plays out as. So I'm going to read it. I must raise one other question, since Wilkerson expends a great deal of effort to show why the similarities between caste in India and race in the US are so striking. My question is this: if caste in the US is a kind of code which is buried deep under the surface of race, how can we compare it to a society like India, where caste is both the code and the everyday reality? Put another way, either India has no underlying social program, grammar, and theory, and its social world is simply caste all the way up and down, something he doubts. Or Wilkerson's dramatic unearthing of caste under the surface of race in the US is just a literary device to tell a familiar American story in an unfamiliar way, and is not based on a genuine similarity. Which I think, is his overarching point. And I wanted to put Upper the Ray's highlights to start with, because I think it creates these thematic engagement that I spoke about, and that kind of really shows up again in all of the other reviews, perhaps in a more nuanced way, but he kind of sums it up quite concisely. And then there's the idea of the present. Like I said, I think this we'll see more in the other couple of reviews, but essentially it's talking about like how there's a lack of rooting or awareness in the present. And thinking truly of what does blackness mean now, and what does the Dalit life mean now, the lives of Dalit people mean now. So yeah, and I'll leave this in the PDF so you all can read it. So we'll go on to Hazel, and I kind of start where it left off, which is I left off in the previous part, which is where there's the idea of awareness and the world and the present moment. As we know, as we might have read, this review starts with this anecdote of the Cano seat, and her kind of being like, this is this looked over piece in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and she, in the entire article she kind of rotates back and gives us what that is, right? But she starts with this highlight which looks at what is this and why is this Cano seed and the lack of importance that it's given one way to think about what Wilkerson's book is doing. So I think exceptionalism might be the wrong word. Maybe I understanding it not the right way, but I think this highlight is quite literal, and I'm going to read it in order to elucidate my point. So Hazel says, the trade in commodified human beings was, however, integral to a global, not national project of colonial modernity. As African and indigenous people were dispossessed and subjugated, a multiplicity of complex, entangled racial formations were created across the Americas. The black national narrative has come to dominate the popular and academic imagination in the US, mirroring the theory of American exceptionalism and separating the history of African Americans from the histories of the descendants of other survivors of the crossing. So I think one of the biggest points for me from this review is also highlighting how part of what seems to be wrong with Wilkerson's book, and part of which we read, is in creating this sense of um, important narrative about the Black life and history in America, but in doing so, doing something that has often been done, which is making everything essentially about America, right? In a very different context, it kind of is like this whole question of like, why do aliens always invade just the U.S. and if not the U.S., the U.S. and the Japan, and that's about it, right? Why is Spider-Man only in the U.S., right? So this general idea of like, again, of course, it's more nuanced and important what she's trying to make, which I'll look into in the next couple of slides. But I think that's the big thing, which is what is this book trying to do? Is it trying to like, while it's talking about all these important things with a lot of references, a lot of secondary sources, is it actually just doing something that's been done a lot of times? So exception question mark. This is also a direct read that I'm going to do. So she says, the trade in commodified human beings was, however, integral to global, not national, project of colonial modernity. As African and indigenous people were dispossessed and subjugated, a multiplicity of complex, entangled racial formations were created across the Americas. The Black national narrative has come to dominate the popular and academic imagination in the US, mirroring the theory of American exceptionalism and separating the history of African Americans from the histories of the descendants of other survivings of the crossing. The plural geopolitical concept of the Americas is rendered meaningless when the US is seen as America rather than a region within America, and the history of its Black population treated as definitive of a Black experience separate from the histories of the peoples oppressed, displaced, and eradicated by settler colonialism and its aftermath. So yeah, again, like building on that idea, right, which is what part of which also alludes to a lot of what we read about this idea of like the Black Atlantic, and thinking about truly what that means and what is not seen in a book like Caste by Wilkerson. The theme of focus comes back in, where she's like, okay, now I'm trying to talk about this idea that there's something questionable about not having a focus on the global scale of what Black experience is, and questioning like, what does it mean to be Black? Are you Black if you are obviously temporarily relevant? In Africa and America, what is this idea of Blackness and how there's this disjunction I just spoke about? She also then talks about like how even if we look into the book, kind of passing through that questionable situation, there's this problem in how she seems to be highlighting even inside America in itself, in term about it still being about the privileged people, right? Having some sort, even inside the focus of America and not seeing that global aspect, she's questioning who are you still looking at, which then comes back to the idea of the present again, which is relevant to the idea of focus, what I just spoke about, but then also given when the book came out and what the contemporary conversation is, she also questions what does that mean, like if you're not focusing and you're looking at this educated elite, for the most part, what does that then mean when we think about the contemporary moment? And she says like health inequities between white people and people of color in the US are stark, but her focus is not those who are currently dying of COVID at 3 times the rate of the white population, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx populations who are overrepresented in the carceral system, who rely on underfunded, understaffed schools and hospitals, who live in the poorest neighborhoods, so on and so forth. So she explains who the people truly are affected and in a way aren't seen, right? And she ends by saying not the paper, but this part of the highlight, the studies on which Wilkerson draws claim that the caste system takes years of the lives of subordinate caste people who find themselves in contention with. Well, these people are highly educated, compete in fields where they are not expected to be, and experience a lower life expectancy as a result. So I think like she's really digging in, right? And she's like digging into being like, okay, who are your sources? What are you looking at? If you're making these already problematic statements, which are kind of like the outside, but here she's kind of trying to look at like what is the inside, what is the groundwork that you're working on, which in itself seems to be questionable. The focus of language comes in, where this is something that Apadrai has pointed out to, which is again questioning what is the motive for her to use the word caste. So, yeah, y'all can read this because I realize I'm taking more time, but the question is again, what is the motive of using the language? She ends her review kind of as a loop back to where we started, which I find, just cool as, as a method of making a written piece of work, which I liked. But, she also uses that to give us information about what was initially kind of murky, and she was talking about how it was looked over. She gives us the entire information about what that is. But in doing that, she's trying to make her point, which has been, I think, the core message from the start, which is, again, this book is interesting. It's saying things, but one, there's a lot of problematic things in it. But the biggest failure for me in what I understood from her writing is that it excludes in every rung of the social order that it's trying to talk about a lot of people. So yeah, that's where, we come to Anupama Rao. And with her, I think I'm going to read more of what, I directly highlighted here. But I think in the reviews we read, for me, her review was one of the ones that were more maybe lenient or understanding or trying to create some sort of logic to better understand it than the other ones, which I think were more hostile towards the book. So she creates more ground, but also she points out the connection a lot between a lot of the readings that we had before, particularly to do with Ambedkar, which we'll kind of get to in the end of me looking at Anupama Rao. So here you can see she talks about how there was that meeting between King traveling over and then kind of being disillusioned but not ever acknowledging it, and kind of unearthing the idea which we saw through various readings about there's a lot of things questioned about what Gandhi's values are, which King used to otherwise very much be a proponent of, in terms of how he was possibly very casteist, possibly really casteist with his values, Gandhi, that is. Again, the idea of language comes back here. There's a question of what the motive of caste is, and for that I'm just going to read from this line. I think her point is very well illustrated here, which is, but why then is the lexicon Wilkerson has chosen drawn from a social order that she believes has both predated and outlasted state-sponsored racism? Since her intervention has less to do with the Indian caste than with the changing conditions of American racism, I wonder whether Wilkerson has not politicized race at the cost of essentializing caste. She grasps the power of Indian parallels, but she does not engage sufficiently with caste to understand the deep lessons it has for the American experience. Now, on thinking of focus, but this is the thing, right? She brings in this idea of what is the focus, but then also suggests a logic that I think, which is where the idea of lenience comes from me, where I think there's more ground where we might be able to understand Wilkerson's approach in Anupama Rao's review. So she says, in brief, caste is a Malayan social order with an equally long history of conflict transformation. A dual perspective helps relate caste with democracy in much the same manner as we might approach the paradox of race and democracy, and not merely through a shared inventory of violations, as Wilkerson suggests. And this is where the core point for me is, she's less interested in the history of the concept than in the power of the analogy. Wilkerson's focus on shared logics of abjection and social outcasting leads to comparison of three caste hierarchies in the world: India, the United States, and Nazi Germany. Her interest is in the reproduction of hierarchy and systemic inequality, and less on the efforts to change it. This appears to justify the compression of divergent histories and incommensurable timelines. So that's where my general focus of trying to find a few themes that these people, when they were reviewing, wrote about. But to end my presentation, I wanted to also highlight two things that I think were important in Anupama Rao's review, which I think most of these reviews didn't necessarily highlight by virtue perhaps of their distance from South Asia. So one was the act of Du Bois, which So she speaks initially about talking about like how Alison Davidson, who is one of the important people that Wilkerson is inspired by, but after speaking about like what her inspirations and who she basically took from as sources, she then talks about Du Bois, which is like here she says one of the central features of Du Bois' analysis in his epic Black Reconstruction was his idea of actually using caste, and he was even thinking of using it already, which was, I think, important for me to point out, because a lot of the reviews kind of speak about how she does inspire from other places, but the focus seems to be about like criticizing her use of it, which I think is obviously important and the point. But it was interesting for me to like just read this and be like, oh, so Du Bois did this also, as a reminder. But again, Anupama Rao immediately in a couple of paragraphs flips it by saying how then there's a divergence of what it is that Ambedkar was parallelly talking about, and how that then presents a divergence, which is important for us to kind of assimilate this entire idea of Wilkerson's book, and which for us was the chapters we read, which I think is best then encapsulated in this last paragraph, which I'll kind of read to end my presentation. So for both Du Bois and Ambedkar, the language of class, labor, and capital were key to understanding modern caste, even when the intellectual journeys diverged. Black Reconstruction moved Du Bois further towards the embrace of a communism he made his own in the quest to understand white supremacy. Ambedkar challenged the adequacy of a merely materialist response to the historical violence of caste and privileged the Buddha's radical humanism contra Marx. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. The link to this is going to be there kind of in the PDF pack that I send. It's been 22 minutes, which is way longer than I anticipated, but I hope, Professor, you're seeing this, and if, some of your students, like some of us friends, homies in the class are actually watching this still, I really appreciate you sticking around. Thank you for taking your time from my presentation. I'll also have some references, including this, which I think were really relevant and inspiring as I read through one Wilkerson's part of the book we read, and also these reviews, because I just think there's so much that even this one reading and its reviews reveals. So yeah, thank you.